Hey everyone. Today I want to talk about something crucial for not just your relationships, but your overall well-being, and that's boundaries. Boundaries is one of those buzzwords that gets tossed around a lot. But what does having boundaries actually mean? And more importantly, how do you set them and enforce them? That's what we're going to talk about today. Many of us are not living boundary-filled lives. That's the reality. And without boundaries, we often find ourselves exhausted, resentful, and overextended. We wake up in the morning with no desire or the emotional space to deal with people. And that comes from not having boundaries and not honoring ourselves by enforcing boundaries. So today I'll be breaking down 5 key types of boundaries that you might be lacking in your relationships, whether that's with your family, your lover, your friends, or even at work with your coworker or your other business relationships. For those of you new to the channel, I'm Kerri McKenna Reece, trauma recovery coach and accredited instructor, and I'm on a mission to guide others through the pain and complexity of complex trauma. I also want to give a big shout out to everyone of you here today who have already subscribed. Thank you so much. You are greatly appreciated. My hope is that for everyone watching, by the end of this video, you'll have a clear understanding of where your boundaries might be weak, and more importantly, how you can strengthen them so you can start respecting, honoring, and truly loving yourself. We need boundaries if we want to live a joyful life. Boundaries are not barriers meant to punish people. Boundaries are put in place to teach people how to properly love us. So let's start with emotional boundaries because this is a huge one. Emotional boundaries are the foundation of self-preservation. When you have healthy emotional boundaries, it's a game changer in life. Our ability to set emotional boundaries, it isn't random. It's shaped by our earliest attachments, our deepest connections, and our family experiences. If you grew up in a household where everyone had to feel the same way, where individual emotions weren't honored and it wasn't okay to feel differently, where expressing feelings like sadness, anger, or even happiness was met with shame or dismissal, where you were taught that showing emotions made you weak, then chances are today you feel responsible for everyone else's emotions as if their happiness or pain depends entirely on you. You instinctively step in to fix them, soothe them, or take responsibility for their emotions, emotions that aren't yours to carry. You don't just notice the emotions of other people, you absorb them. You take on their sadness, their frustration or anxiety as if it were your own. You dismiss or reject emotions, your own emotions, and the emotions of those around you because acknowledging them feels overwhelming or unfamiliar. And when you do show emotions, you feel the need to justify them, as if you're standing trial in a courtroom, presenting every detail like evidence in a desperate attempt to validate your own feelings. You may also find yourself emotionally dumping on people, unloading your pain onto others without considering whether they have the capacity to hold it. The hurt you've carried for so long, it just spills out uncontrollably, driven by an urgent need to be seen, heard, and valued. And yet, despite giving so much, you feel utterly drained, constantly expected to be emotionally available for others, while you yourself are drowning in your own unprocessed emotions. This isn't just exhausting, it's a betrayal of ourselves. Over time, these emotions, this emotional entanglement, it blurs the line between where others end and we begin. I want to say that again. Lacking emotional boundaries makes it difficult to distinguish where others end and where we begin. We become so consumed with fixing, absorbing, justifying, and carrying emotions that were never ours to hold that our own needs fade into the background. We dismiss them, we silence them. And in doing so, we leave ourselves depleted, disconnected, and trapped in a relentless cycle of emotional overwhelm, constantly filtering our own feelings through the needs, expectations, and emotions of others. But here's the truth. Your emotions are yours and their emotions are theirs. You're not responsible for fixing emotions that don't belong to you. Learning to distinguish between the two of them is one of the most powerful acts of self-preservation. Your emotions deserve space. Your needs matter, and you are not responsible for carrying what isn't yours. When you blur emotional boundaries, you ride the emotional roller coaster of the people around you, leaving yourself completely drained. But when you start reinforcing your boundaries, you regain your emotional autonomy. And that right there is true freedom. So, how do we set emotional boundaries? We have to start recognizing that everyone is allowed to have their own emotional experiences. You don't have to feel what they feel. You don't have to jump in the box and take it on as your own. Number two, you want to ask yourself before venting, instead of unloading on someone, check in with them first. Ask them, hey, do you have space to talk right now? Respect that others may not always be emotionally available. And three, stop over explaining your feelings. You don't need to justify them. Your emotions are valid without needing permission, approval, or proof to express them. Now, let's take a deeper talk. Let's talk a little deeper about emotional triggers because this is important to understand, okay? If you struggle with emotional boundaries, you will also struggle with triggers. Triggers are absolutely inevitable. People will trigger you. The things you see, taste, smell, touch, and hear will trigger you. I'm probably going to trigger you at some point if you're watching these videos. And those triggers, they hit us out of nowhere, turning us into a tangled mess of emotional spaghetti before we even realize what happened. Even the healing process itself will surface emotional triggers along the way. And that's okay. Triggers, they can feel like landmines because they are unexpected and they're overwhelming. But honestly, they are not the enemy. They're messengers revealing the wounds we have yet to heal. So each trigger, it's an invitation to look inward, to understand ourselves more deeply, to confront what still lingers beneath the surface in us. But here's something really, really important to recognize. The people around us, they have triggers too. And when they're triggered, they often project their emotions onto us, expecting us to take responsibility for their discomfort, their pain, or their anger. They will project on us, blame us, hit us with a guilt trip, lash out, or shut down with us in a silent resentment, expecting you to fix what is not yours to fix. And that is not okay. And this is where many of us fall into the same trap. We shrink ourselves to avoid upsetting others. We walk on eggshells to prevent emotional explosion. We absorb their pain, their anger, their sadness, as if carrying their emotions will somehow ease their suffering. It won't. But their triggers are not your burden to bear, right? Just as your triggers are your responsibility, their triggers are their responsibility. We're not responsible for regulating someone else's emotional reactions. We are not responsible for walking on eggshells to avoid triggering others. And we are not responsible for fixing emotions that don't belong to us. We're also not responsible for keeping them comfortable at the expense of our own peace. And we are not responsible for fixing what we did not break. Most emotional triggers are rooted in childhood wounds when we were completely dependent on our caregivers. If our emotional and physical needs were not met back then, we adapted, right? Developing patterns and behaviors designed to protect us. And here we are as adults with nervous systems set on hypervigilance, tapping into unhealthy neuropathways that make us feel like a small child over and over again. So recognizing our triggers it's not a sign of weakness, it's a doorway to healing. When we learn to sit with our triggers instead of running from them, when we choose to acknowledge and process the feelings and emotions around them instead of projecting them, we begin to not only break this cycle, but we begin to reinforce stronger boundaries and reclaim our emotional autonomy, a space that really is rightfully ours. And when someone else is triggered, we can offer them compassion without carrying their pain. We can hold space for them without making their emotions our own, because you're not responsible for healing wounds that don't belong to you. When we stop absorbing everyone else's emotions, when we stop shrinking ourselves to protect others from their own triggers, we step into a new level of freedom, one where our emotional boundaries are clear, our energy is protected, and we no longer carry what was never ours to hold. Okay, so now let's talk about material boundaries. Material boundaries go beyond just possessions. They reflect our self-worth, respect, and the value we place on our time, energy, and resources. For many trauma survivors, setting material boundaries can feel deeply uncomfortable. Maybe you grew up believing that giving to others meant love and that saying no made you selfish. Maybe you were taught that your needs didn't matter as much as keeping the peace. But here's the truth. What belongs to you matters. Your space, your belongings, and your resources are yours to protect. Weak material boundaries often show up as feeling guilty for saying no when someone asks you to borrow something, allowing people to take your belongings without asking, lending things out only to have them returned damaged, late, or not returned at all, or feeling obligated to give, lend, or share even when it's at your own expense. And let's be honest, this isn't just about stuff. It's about the unspoken belief that our needs come second. Every time we let someone cross this line, every time we allow someone to mistreat what is ours, we reinforce the message that was given to us as a child. And that is that our boundaries don't matter, right? So how do we set material boundaries? Number one, you need to give yourself permission to say no. Straight up say, I'm not comfortable lending that out. No justification is needed, no guilt, just a simple, firm boundary. No. If you don't mind lending something out, but want it returned in the condition it was lent, you can say, understand I'm loaning this to you and I need it returned in the same condition you're receiving it. Setting this expectation ensures your belongings are treated with care they deserve or misplaced if they're mistreated. Now, number three, if someone takes advantage of something you've lent them, address it directly and respectfully. You can say, I'd appreciate it if my things were returned to me and returned in the same condition I lent them. Setting this expectation ensures your belongings are returned and reaffirms that you expect them replaced if they're damaged. It's important that we recognize that we don't have to prove our generosity by always giving. Love, respect, and worth are not measured by how much we sacrifice. Our belongings, our time and resources, they're extensions of ourselves. We need to always treat them with the same care and respect that we deserve. Okay, time and energy boundaries is another one we need to touch on. This boundary is also a game changer because time and energy are two things you can never ever get back once it's given away. And I don't know about y'all, but I don't have enough time in my day now. For many trauma survivors, protecting our time and energy, it can really feel foreign, even selfish. We may have been conditioned to believe that our worth is tied to how much we give, how much we do, how much we accommodate others. But here's what no one told us. Constantly overextending ourselves is not an act of love. It's 100% self-abandonment. When you fail to protect your time and energy, you end up exhausted, resentful, and stretched so thin that there's nothing left for you. And that is extremely unhealthy. Weak time and energy boundaries, they often show up as saying yes out of guilt, even when every part of you wants to say no, allowing people to waste your time with constant cancellations, lateness, or never following through on what they say. It can also show up as feeling drained and depleted because people expect your attention whenever they need it without considering your capacity or availability. And it can also show up as feeling like you have to be available 24/7, responding instantly to text calls and requests, because if you don't, you feel disappointing or upsetting. You fear you're going to disappoint or upset someone. Here's the truth, though. Your time is sacred, your energy is precious, and you have the right to decide where and how they are spent. So, how do we set time and energy boundaries? Number one, you must start saying no without guilt, without ever explaining or over explaining. We don't have to justify ourselves to anyone. Your decisions only have to feel right to you. No is a full and complete sentence, period. Number two, if someone disrespects your time, address it. You can say, I value my time and I need you to respect it. Your time is just as important as theirs. And this is a huge, huge pet peeve of mine. I understand that things happen. However, when it happens repeatedly, I address it directly, letting them know. Please understand and know that I say this with care. Your lateness and your lack of follow through on things, it's not gone unnoticed. Uh, my time is just as important as yours, right? And I make it clear that if it happens again, I won't be making plans with them in the future. Also, it needs to be recognized that we are not on call for the world. Stop feeling like you have to always be available. Stop sleeping with your cell phone. Stop checking your email in the middle of the night. It's okay to pause, step back, and respond when it works for you. Facebook and other social media accounts, they're going to be there tomorrow. Give yourself permission every morning to put yourself first and take care of you. Our energy is a limited resource and we need to protect it. Our time is not owed to anyone. It's yours to give on your terms, no one else's. Okay, so mental boundaries is next on the list. Mental boundaries safeguard your thoughts, your beliefs, and your values. When you have strong mental boundaries, you don't feel pressured to change your beliefs just to fit in, just to gain approval or feel worthy of love and respect from others. It also means you don't force your beliefs onto others. You honor their autonomy. Signs of weak mental boundaries are feeling like your thoughts or opinions aren't valid in a relationship. Maybe you hesitate to express yourself, fearing that your perspective will be dismissed, ridiculed, or ignored. If you grew up in a toxic home, chances are your voice was silenced early on, leaving you with a sense of deep-seated self-doubt, conditioning whether your feelings and viewpoints even matter. On the other hand, if you were raised in a healthy environment, but now find yourself in an unhealthy relationship as an adult, that constant fear of speaking up can slowly erode your confidence, right? Making you doubt yourself in ways you never did before. And today, you may constantly feel like you have to agree with someone to keep the peace. Another way signs of weak mental boundaries show up is where you struggle to set limits with people who try to force their beliefs onto you. Whether it's family, friends, or colleagues, you feel pressured to conform to their opinions, values, or ways of thinking. Instead of being able to hold space for differing perspectives, you might feel cornered, unheard, or even guilted into seeing things their way. And this can make you feel powerless, as though your autonomy is constantly being chipped away. This goes back to growing up in a toxic home as well, or as an adult being in a relationship that lacks emotional maturity. So, how do we set mental boundaries? Number one, we need to remind ourselves that our thoughts and beliefs are valid, even if they differ from other people. We are allowed to have our own perspective, values, and opinions, and we don't need external validation. Your truth does not become less valuable just because someone else disagrees with it. We also need to avoid arguing just to convince others. You don't have to prove yourself to anyone. Emotional maturity is a healthy discussion. Engaging in endless arguments to gain approval or force understanding will only drain your energies. Not everyone will see the world the way you do, and that's okay. It's just as important to recognize when a conversation is turning into an argument and removing yourself from it. Don't allow yourself to be invited into arguments to defend your perspective. Protect your peace by ending the conversation. My grandmother was a pro at this. In the middle of a conversation that she no longer wanted to participate in, she'd say, "Have you noticed the weather lately?" And no matter what they said next, to remove herself from the conversation, she'd say, "Have you noticed the weather lately?" It shut them down every time, or she would keep repeating herself, asking about the weather until they got the hint. She was protecting her peace, and protecting our peace is always best. So let's dive into the last one and talk about physical boundaries. Having been sexually abused for 13 years in my childhood, this is a huge one for me. Physical boundaries involve personal space, touch, and comfort levels. But setting physical boundaries isn't just about us, it's also about our children, the next generation. Teaching children early on that they have control over their own bodies and their own space is crucial. When they understand that their body belongs to them, they become less likely to question who has the right to touch them or invade their space. And by encouraging them to trust their instincts and empowering them with this knowledge, we help them grow up knowing that their comfort matters, their boundaries are important, and they deserve to be respected. When children are not taught to uphold their physical boundaries, they are left more vulnerable to predators, manipulation, and potential harm. So, what are the signs of weak physical boundaries? It's when you or your child feel uncomfortable when someone invades your personal space, but you don't speak up. Maybe it's a coworker standing too close, a relative insisting on hugs and kisses, a child refusing to sit on Santa's lap, or a friend who doesn't recognize when space is needed. The discomfort is clear, the body tenses, unease sets in, or a child begins to cry, but instead of asserting your boundaries or acknowledging the child's distress, silence takes over. This might be out of politeness, fear of making things awkward, or a deep-rooted conditioning to tolerate discomfort rather than challenge it. Over time, this silence, it'll lead to resentment, anxiety, and a disconnected from our own personal needs and autonomy, making it harder to recognize and enforce boundaries in the future. Another sign of weak physical boundaries is when someone touches you, even non-romantically, or touches your child in a way that makes you uneasy. It could be a lingering handshake, an unexpected touch on the back, or an arm around the shoulder that feels intrusive. For a child, it may be a pat on the head or an affectionate gesture that they instinctively shy away from. Regardless of intention, discomfort is a sign that a boundary is being crossed. And when that discomfort is ignored over time, it teaches the subconscious that personal space is not within our control, leading to difficulty recognizing or enforcing boundaries later in life. Another sign of weak physical boundaries is when you experience unwanted comments about your body or appearance. It might be framed as a joke, a compliment, or casual conversation, but it doesn't feel okay because it's not. Whether it's a remark about weight, how you look in an outfit, or even your facial expressions, these unsolicited comments can feel invasive and objectifying. For a child, this might sound like a relative making remarks about their size, their features, or how they should give a little smile, or how they should, behave, stop dancing, shut up, sit down. Over time, these comments can create body image issues, self-consciousness, and a discomfort in their own skin. Your body and your child's body is not up for public commentary, and you have the right to shut it down, to shut down conversations that feel intrusive and disrespectful. So now, how do we set physical boundaries? Number one, if you're uncomfortable, I encourage you to say just that. Say, I'm not comfortable with that. And when it comes to your child, advocate for them. Say, they're not comfortable with that. They don't want to kiss, hug, or sit on your lap. Your feelings are valid, your child's feelings are valid, and you don't need to explain or justify them. As parents, it is our responsibility to be the voice for our children when they are too young to speak for themselves. Discomfort for any reason is reason enough to set a boundary. A child crying, pulling away, shutting down, or showing distress is more than enough justification to step in and enforce that boundary. No further explanation is required. Number two, if someone is touchy or invades your space, move away and tell them directly. You have the right to protect your personal space and your child's space. If someone isn't respecting that, step up or speak up and you can say, I need more space, or please don't touch me. And when it comes to your child, be their voice. When they can't speak up for themselves, advocate for them. You could say, they need more space. Please step back, or please keep your hands to yourself. Your personal space and your child's is not up for debate. It is yours to protect, enforce, and uphold. You don't owe, now this is number three, you don't owe anyone physical affection, not even family. Just because someone is a relative doesn't mean they're entitled to hugs, kisses, or any form of touch. Affection should be freely given, never forced. When it comes to children, respect their boundaries too. Never force a child to sit on someone's lap, hug or kiss someone, or spend time with a person they don't feel comfortable around. That person could be abusing the child, and the child may not know how to tell or maybe too afraid to tell. What seems like harmless gestures to us as adults sometimes can feel very terrifying and deeply distressing to a child. More importantly, forcing physical interactions teaches them to override their own instincts, to ignore discomfort, to comply out of politeness, and to prioritize other people's feelings over their own sense of safety. And this conditioning, it will follow them into adulthood, making them more vulnerable to boundary violations and less likely to recognize when their personal space is being disrespected. Instead, empower children by giving them control over their own bodies. Let them choose how they show affection. Ask them if they want to give that hug or a kiss. Maybe it's a high five or a handshake or a simple wave. Teach them that they have the choice and that their no is absolutely enough and that their comfort matters. It should be a number one. Physical boundaries are about safety, respect, and autonomy. Whether for yourself or for your child, setting them, it's not rude, it's necessary for personal health and well being. Boundaries are not about controlling others, they're about protecting yourself. When we start setting boundaries, some people won't like it, especially if they benefited from your lack of them, but that's okay. Boundaries create healthier relationships. Boundaries reduce stress and burnout. Boundaries help you show up as your most authentic self. And remember, boundaries are for you, they are by you, and they are your lifeline to happiness. Having clear boundaries, having a clear understanding of your needs is the first step. Setting boundaries around those needs is second, and honoring those needs is your lifeline to happiness. If this video was helpful to you, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss any future content. If you think it will help someone, please share it. And until next time, take care of yourself.